Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. In this little session, I'm going to report findings from a survey study with summer study abroad students in Germany, 7 generations of these students, and we were interested in students' perceptions of members of their own culture and members of the host culture, and any potential changes that would take place during study abroad. We were also interested in how they would rate themselves with respect to a number of attributes that have been suggested to facilitate intercultural competence development, and also if there was any change over the time during study abroad. Let me start out with a few remarks about US college students studying abroad and in German-speaking countries in particular. In the academic year of 2014-15, there were about 11,000 students going to Germany, 3,000 plus going to Austria, and 1.7 thousand going to Switzerland, the different areas of Switzerland, while the overall numbers of students going particularly to Germany has increased over time considerably. Percentage-wise, it remained pretty much the same at about 3 to 3.54% maximum. So it's a relatively small proportion of American students going abroad. From previous research, we know that study abroad doesn't automatically lead to gains in language proficiency and intercultural competence development. A number of presentations here are suggesting the same. There's a great deal of individual variation. We also know that students' expectations before going to study abroad are usually very, very high, often higher compared to the gains, the learning gains that they report at the end of the program. And we know that some studies also show a number of negative effects of study abroad in a number of students, probably due to lack of language fluency and cultural competence. These can, in some cases, lead to disappointment and frustration on the part of the learners, to more negative perceptions of or stereotypes about the members of the host culture, and a decrease in motivation. And these are, of course, things that we as language program administrators or teachers are not necessarily interested in. We would like them to come back enthusiastically, hopefully continuing their language and culture study in our departments. Of course, research has also shown positive effects of study abroad. Some show less stereotyping. Some show that negative preconceptions of the host culture turn into more favorable ones, and more confidence, independence, and emotional stability, things that, of course, we would like to see our students develop in their time abroad. Okay, in this study, we focused on students' perceptions and attitudes toward the own and other culture, and we saw this as part of intercultural competence development. Many see attitudes as an important precondition for intercultural competence development. On the other hand, we were interested in students' self-ratings of attributes potentially related to intercultural competence development. And again, in possible changes of these perceptions and self-ratings. The program that the students studied in was the Arizona Summer Study in Leipzig, Germany program. It's a 1-month summer study program in Leipzig in Eastern Germany. Eligible are students with a minimum of 2 semesters of college German. We teach 2 levels, a second year and a third plus year course over there. They have 4 hours of language instruction 5 days a week, 2-3 day trips, a weekend excursion are accommodated in student dorms, and are assigned a tandem partner, kind of a language exchange partner with whom they practice German and English in exchange, hopefully learning from each other. Participants were the generations from 2010 and 2016. Here's a picture of the 2011 generation with a German soccer team. There were 157 program participants in total, all undergraduate students of different majors and minors, just taking German. 80 were enrolled in the second-year German course, 51 in the third-year German course. There were more females than males, as is the case in many study abroad programs. Just a note on their motives. The most important motives for participation in the program were cultural enrichment, being in contact with Germans, travel and study of German. No big surprises here. For some, earning university credit was an important aspect as well. And this is just as a side note, how they perceived their learning gains or programs at the end of the program. And here, culture was really the aspect that students reported to have learned most during this time abroad compared to the different language skills. The research questions, just to repeat one more time, were how do participants perceive and rate members of their own culture, US Americans, versus members of the target culture, the Germans, before the beginning of the program and at program end. Also how they rated themselves with respect to attributes suggested to foster intercultural competence development. The instruments that we used, the first one was the questionnaire in which they received basically 22 adjectives and a rating scale of 1 to 4, and they had to decide to what extent these attributes applied to members of their own culture and the other culture. So this looked something like this: adjectives like emotional, serious, friendly, confident, logical, and they rated members of their own culture and then members of the other before the program start and at the end of the program. The second questionnaire also contained a list of 22 personality traits, attributes, suggested to be relevant for the development of intercultural competence. And here they rated themselves on a scale from 1, doesn't apply at all to me, to 6, very much, applies very much to me. Here are some of these attributes: open-mindedness, flexibility with attitudes and behavior, ability to adapt your behavior, comfort with uncertainty, and others. These kinds of pretty straightforward kind of a self-assessment on this scale. And so we compared the mean scores from the pre-program survey with post-program survey results through t-test analysis. What did we find? These are the results of the pre-program survey. The students rated Americans overall as more emotional, more lazy, more impatient, more loud and arrogant compared to the Germans. Quite a critical assessment of members of their own culture. They rated the Germans more logical, more hardworking, calm, honorable, serious, efficient, competent, and honest than the Americans, and a good number of attributes in which they rated the members of the two cultures quite similarly. Now, how did these ratings change, if at all, during study abroad? Let's first take a look at the perceptions of the Germans. There were really no substantial changes in the perception of Germans, although we found significant differences for a number of post-test scores. They even rated the Germans as less loud than they had before, as even more calm than they thought they were before, shy, honest, and thrifty. They also rated them to be a bit more lazy than they had expected early on. It may not all be about efficiency and work over there. So pre-program ratings or preconceptions of the Germans have mostly been confirmed in the post-study. How did that look with respect to ratings of Americans? Here we also have a strengthening of preconceptioning. They indeed perceived Americans as louder at the end of the study, even more so than the beginning, and more emotional compared to the Germans. Again, these confirm and strengthen previous ratings. But, and this I think is quite interesting, there are also a number of positive values, attributes, according to which they rate Americans higher than before. They find them to be more friendly than before, more generous, good-humored, logical, and patient. So what seems to be going on towards the end of the program is that they valorize and appreciate certain aspects of members of their own culture more than before. Remember, the rating was quite critical at the beginning of the program. There are a number of differences between second and third generation, which we can perhaps look at in the discussion. So far, I'd just like to mention that the second-year students revise their perceptions and ratings of the Americans somewhat more than the third-year students at the end of the program. Let me now turn to the second question, the self-ratings of attributes potentially related to intercultural competence development. And if we look at this graph in very general terms, again, we see relatively little change between pre-program and post-program surveys. There are a number of significant differences, particularly decreases, though, in scores. They, on average, rate themselves somewhat lower in these scores: respect for others, willingness to change oneself, ability to adapt, open-mindedness, empathy, and tactfulness. Something that we wouldn't really necessarily want to see in our students decrease. There was one significant increase in self-ratings, and that's comfort with uncertainty. At the end of the program, they felt more comfortable with uncertainty. Okay, but most of the attributes that they used to self-rate themselves didn't show any significant change between pre-program and post-program survey. Things like willingness to have own views challenged, being invigorated by differences, creativity, win-win attitude, humility, etc. Okay, there were also a couple of difference between the second and the third-year students. So far, I'd just like to mention that the second-year students change self-ratings on average in 3 cases. The third-year students change them less often, just in 2 cases. So in the majority of cases, these self-estimates are quite stable and don't show much change. Now, how do we interpret these findings? Let's stick with the second research question, the personality traits potentially related to intercultural competence development. They seem to be quite stable in our students during this 4-week, 1-month period abroad. They possibly are already quite developed in this group of students, particularly if we compare this and maybe in our study abroad students to the many students that decide never to study abroad. Only 1 in 10 US BA students will ever study abroad for credit. We noticed that there were some lower post-program ratings with respect to a number of attributes related to intercultural competence development. Now, does that mean or suggest that they are less culturally competent because they find themselves to be to have less respect for others, for example? I don't think so. What I think is going on, that they probably overestimated themselves in the previous or pre-program ratings, that they thought, oh, well, I'm pretty independent, I have respect for others, etc. If we interview students who want to go study abroad, yeah, I won't feel homesick, I'm independent, etc. And maybe if they go there, and they may realize that some of these things may actually not be that easy, and perhaps they become a little more critical of themselves and their capabilities. Also, well, just on a side note, probably not all of these attributes that we find in these lists may necessarily be relevant for the development of intercultural competence. Let's turn to the first question again. Participants' ratings of members of the German cultures. They were very similar in the post-program ratings compared to the pre-program. Stereotypes, preconceptions are often reinforced and substantiated. They often, in this case, reflect relatively positive views of the target culture, perhaps even an idealization. They chose to study over there. They studied the language and culture, made a commitment to go there. That's probably the case for many of our study abroad students. Fortunately, what I think we found is no indication really of less positive perceptions of the target culture, which didn't really raise red flags of issues in the program. What about the participants' ratings of members of their own culture? Here, I think we found an increased awareness about traits of their own culture, and again, some reinforcement and substantiation of stereotypes that they had at the beginning, on the one hand, but also an increased acceptance and appreciation of certain traits that they didn't think were really necessarily part of their own culture. And they didn't, they did this without really depreciating the other culture. Okay, and this kind of learning about themselves and changing certain views about oneself or members of their own culture seems to be an important learning outcome. Of course, there are plenty of limitations for these kinds of studies. There are different program types, and our findings certainly cannot be generalized for all kinds of programs. We only use this kind of survey method, which is quite limited and could and should be complemented by other data, maybe more qualitative data. But we think that we can conclude that short-term study abroad may not always change perceptions of and attitudes toward members of the other culture. And maybe that doesn't have to be the case. If they are mostly positive at the beginning, then stability of overall attitudes and preconceptions about the target culture may actually be a good thing. Learning about oneself, accepting and appreciating traits of one's own culture without depreciating the other could and should be an important learning outcome. Thank you very much.